Okay. We're doing it, guys. We're really doing it. Episode number 6. Oh boy, we are here. 100%. We're here. Let's do it. Let's talk. This is episode number 6, the You and Johnny Blue podcast. Today we're going to talk about chivalry. And man, it's going to be good. It's going to be fun. That's the funny thing is like this is going to be fun. We're going to do it together and that is so important. That's super important. But disclaimer, I have had a long week. I've been working up here on a work trip and I haven't slept a lot. And you know how sometimes when you want to say something and there's a word that you know would be perfect, it would perfectly communicate what you're trying to say, and you know it exists, but you don't know what it is, and you're trying to think about it, but you don't even really know how you think of something, so you're trying to just like think and hope that it comes into your mind because that's the best that you can do, and we have really no other way of thinking other than that, just hoping that whatever mechanism inside our brain spontaneously shows up the word in our mind, that process will happen, and it doesn't. Well, that's how my brain is right now. So bear with me. But words are so important. Words are super important. And dude, what a great segue actually into our conversation today about chivalry, because we want to talk about the word chivalry. And we want to talk about how this is a loosely held opinion of mine, okay? So if this upsets you, it's okay that it upsets you. Maybe I'm wrong. And I've actually been working on trying to approach these types of things in a non dualistic way. And what that means is that you hold both contrary opinions in your mind at the same time. And there exists this tension in that space because there's a tension between two opposing views. And when you hold those things as true and you sort of create a space for yourself in between them, the idea is that it creates a third option. And the idea is that that third option should transcend the two and include both of them. All right. So if you think I'm wrong, I can totally resonate with that because the other half of my mind thinks I'm wrong too. And I can kind of see from that standpoint. Now, I'm not good at that because I just started practicing it, but I'm at least trying. All right. So, with that in mind, let's approach this very hot topic of conversation. Is chivalry good? Is chivalry bad? People say chivalry is dying. Should we let it die? Or should we take a more active role? Should we just kill it? Like, let's just end it? Or should we try to uphold it? Should we try to resurrect it from the dead? Should we try to bolster it up and strengthen it? That's what we want to talk about today. I think we should let it die. I think we should kill it. Now, it might not be for the reason that you think. And so before you disagree with me, hear me out and see what you think. But let's dive in first to the word chivalry and chivalry's origins. The word chivalry comes from the French word cheval, Cheval, which I guess means horse. And so the origins of the word chivalry revolve around the skills associated with handling a horse. So you can see that the term has come a long way from its origins to what we use it now to refer as to a man, opening the door for a female, or a guy paying for coffees on a first date. It's come a long way, and that's fine. But let's go way back to when it first started, and let's look at the word and some of the things that are really closely tied into the word, because I am wondering if we can separate all of the things that were tied into the word in its origins, the cultural context, the gender roles, the views of women in general. And I'm wondering if we're able to now just refer to the good parts of it, or if when we're trying to be proponents of this chivalrous code of conduct, if there's actually pieces built into that code of conduct that are working at a cross purpose towards our ultimate goal. If a woman is wanting to promote chivalry or hoping a man will treat her in a chivalrous way because she wants to feel respected or because she wants equality, the question is promoting chivalry going to be working at cross purposes to those goals? Now, some of the conduct associated with quote unquote chivalrous behavior, the way we view it now, is nice. And I could see how, as a woman having to be on the short end of the stick, relatively speaking, in terms of being subjugated to extreme inequity and intolerable, unspeakable, awful things, being on the receiving end of that throughout the course of human history, I feel like it's fine to want to get some reparations for that. So if that's the goal, I'm totally cool with that. I just don't know if us hoping that chivalry is the answer to that, or trying to say that we want chivalry to somehow return, I'm not sure if that's the best solution. And that's kind of what we want to talk about. Now, maybe it is, but let's dive deeper into it. But before we do that, before we go back to the skills required with handling a horse, I want to talk about the word respect, because this word is crucial. It's central to this conversation. Remember that the words that we use have deep meaning, and really clearly understanding those words is really central to us working towards the goal that we're ultimately trying to achieve. The word respect, when we break it down, the first part is which means to do again or to go back, to do a second time. The second part is spect, which, if you think of spectator, somebody who's viewing, spectacle, something that's viewed through, or that which things are viewed through to help you see things more clearly. The term refers to viewing an object. The added to the front indicates we're going back to view this object a second time. So when we respect something, we're going back to take a deeper look at it, or a more contemplative approach. And the idea is that the first time we view something, we view it as an object. And when we objectify something, we examine the parts to make a determination about the whole. So when we view something as an object, we examine the parts to determine the whole. Now, when you think, when I say objectify, the first thing that probably comes to mind is men objectifying women, and our definition works pretty well. Men examining the parts and using that examination to make a determination about the whole. This is obviously not good, and they're not treating these women with respect, right? We can all agree upon that. What happens when a man starts to respect a woman? What happens is when we go back and we view something a second time, and that's kind of a figurative way of saying we view it in a more contemplative way. We spend time with it, sitting with it, thinking about it, coexisting with a person or an idea. Anything that you develop respect for, what happens is that you subjectify that thing. When you subjectify it, we all know what subjective is, right? Versus objective. Subjectifying it makes it a part of me. When I subjectify something, I make it a part of my own experience. Make it the same as myself. So when you respect something, it becomes a part of you. And going back to objectifying women, men, unless you are seriously messed up, you don't objectify your daughter. You don't view your daughter as a sex object, because you've totally subjectified that person, It's a part of you. Your daughter is so closely tied into your own identity that you can't view her in that way. You respect her. And this is the same for anything that we develop respect for. Let's take a step back. Anytime there's distance between me and something else, I'm able to talk about it and think about it in a certain way. You've heard of people like making jokes about or using the word retarded. We can only do that in a funny, sort of lighthearted, joking way if no one in our family has a developmental or a mental disability. But when somebody in your own experience who's a part of you, a part of your inner group, is affected by that, it's not a joke anymore. Like, it's not funny. And when you hear people use it, it's offensive to you because you know the pain that's associated with that or the difficulty associated with that. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying that way of talking, the distance between that issue and you, allows you to talk about it in a lighthearted, disrespectful way. It's the same with Alzheimer's. Natalie's mom, she developed early onset Alzheimer's, and when people would make Alzheimer's jokes about forgetting, oh, I forgot to bring that, oh, whoa, do you have Alzheimer's? You can only make that joke if Alzheimer's hasn't seriously affected somebody close to you. Once it does, it's not funny anymore. And this happens in so many different situations. The other day, I was researching some statistics, some injury-related statistics for my work on the OSHA website, and all kinds of statistics. And I stumbled across these statistics about death rates per day. And it was saying out of the 7 days of the week, here's how many deaths on average occur each day. And I was like, this is awesome. This is fascinating to me. How many people die on a Monday versus on a Sunday? How many people die on Fridays versus on Tuesdays? Is there any kind of correlation to people's behaviors? Or I was just excited to dive into it and to learn about whoa, when do people die the most? And I was it struck me let me say that again. I was excited to learn about when people die the most. And I was what the heck is my problem? This is really seriously heavy. These numbers on the page are actual people who have died. And this is not something that I should be enjoying or that's a fun little project for me to drink my coffee and be excited about. I mean, and I'm not being super hard on myself, but it struck me as interesting, right? I mean, that I could be so excited about reading about people dying. But the reason is because the statistics were from 2006, and because, honestly, I don't know any of these people. And if I had just recently had a family member who had died or a close friend who had died, it would have hit differently because it would have hit closer to home. And we're about to jump into the conversation for today about chivalry, but understanding what the word respect means and what happens when we respect something is extremely important. It might be more important than we even realize. Even spiritually, in the Bible, they asked Jesus, and you can get meaning from this, whether you believe in the Bible or in Jesus or not, even from a psychological perspective. They asked Jesus was talking about how we should love our neighbors as ourselves, right? Let's first think about that. Loving your neighbor as yourself means you subjectify their experience. You make their experience a part of you. You treat them the way that you would treat yourself, which is subjectifying them. And then these people are okay, well then who do I have to do that to? Who's my neighbor? And then, of course, Jesus tells this enigmatic, mysterious, difficult to understand story in response, which is pretty characteristic of how he answered questions. But even spiritually and religiously, this idea of subjectifying other people's experience is so important. And people think, for instance, I heard Mother Teresa, there was a 3 or 4 year period where she didn't experience, this is what they say, Richard Rohr says this, that Mother Teresa didn't experience a positive emotion for 3 or 4 years. And people would assume that she was maybe depressed, but she wasn't. She was just so, this is what they say, she was so spiritually advanced that the pain that everyone was feeling around her, she almost felt herself, because everyone was her neighbor. When she read a story in the newspaper about a child dying, like, it may have happened in another country, but that distance didn't separate her from that trauma. And it was as if she took that upon herself. And if you want to believe what it says in the Bible about Jesus taking the weight of the world upon his shoulders, that's another way of saying it, that he's so spiritually advanced that it's like everybody's experience was his. Everybody's pain he felt. And that sounds hard, and that sounds like something that none of us could probably tolerate, and for good reason, because we probably aren't at a level where we could do that and it would be good for us, which is the idea of God's Spirit being poured out in a measure that's greater than we can tolerate. But this is not about religion or spirituality. It's about chivalry. So now we're going to step back. Let's jump into the Knight's Code of Conduct. This is interesting stuff. And if we're going to say that we believe that chivalry should continue to be a thing, we have to care about this. You might think, if you were a woman, that, man, what an awesome time to be alive. Like, you had these men who were just devoted to you, who were devoted to protecting your name. At the slightest provocation, you would have this whole host of guys who would literally be willing to die just to protect your honor. This esoteric, ethereal, idealistic idea, your honor. As if someone would dishonor you, they would sacrifice their lives to protect that, to protect your virginity and your purity and your moral standing. And this was part of the Knight's Code, the Code of Chivalry. The problem is it wasn't really a great time to be alive for anybody. We call it the Dark Ages for a reason. And it's mostly because they didn't really have a lot going for them back then. The average lifespan was very short. And, okay, we don't have to get into all the problems associated with being alive back then, but let's just stick to the topic at hand, which is sexism and gender equality. You could say that back then, there was no such thing as gender equality. There was very, very, very entrenched and rigid gender roles. Now, these are the things we want to circle back to when we talk about being proponents of chivalry today. If we are a fan of gender roles, then chivalry might be something that we want to continue. But we can't separate, and again, this is my opinion, but I don't think we're able to separate gender roles from chivalry because of its origins. And even when you look at the way chivalry is played out today in terms of a girl wanting a man to open the door for her or wanting to have her meal paid for as a sign of respect, and that's totally fine. I'm not belittling that. I understand the value in that and the meaning that can be associated with that behavior. But the problem is that it engenders the idea of gender roles, which I think isn't great when our goal is working towards gender equality. I don't think we need to spend a ton of time highlighting the gender roles in the Dark Ages. Needless to say, things were not fair for women. They were actually pretty awful. And the interesting thing about this chivalrous code of conduct on the behalf of the knights is that I think it was more a romanticized and idealized way of relating with beauty. And that's a pretty touchy, pretty slippery slope to start going down, because I believe it's a way of objectifying. There was not a lot of subjectifying there going on in terms of actual respect for womanhood or femininity, even though it might appear that way on the surface. And the reason I'm saying that is because, number one, this chivalrous code didn't extend to all women. It didn't extend to peasant women who, or maid servants or slaves who, if a knight or any man were to rape or molest or get a maidservant or a slave of a landowner pregnant, they just had to pay a fee to that landowner to compensate for the lost time that woman would be able to work while she was pregnant. That's awful. It had nothing to do with the idea of robbing this woman of her dignity or of the most invasive, atrocious thing you can pretty much do to somebody, which is to rape them. The knights didn't seem too concerned about that as being something that was morally reprehensible. And to take it a step further, happening right at the same time as the start of this code of chivalry was the Crusades, which was a time where these knights, the same ones, were going to the east to murder Muslims. And the atrocities that now would be just awful war crimes, like absolutely awful things that these guys would do to the Muslim women, indicates that their whole code of chivalry was pretty loosely based on the actual ideals that they were trying, or that they said they would represent: purity, honor, the woman's virginity, etc. Now, to just quickly fast forward, it's interesting. You've maybe noticed the double standard about how if a woman sleeps with a bunch of guys, there's a negative social stigma associated with that for her reputation. If a guy sleeps with a bunch of women, it's the opposite, right? The double standard is not fair. And it's kind of I don't want to say nonsensical, because there's a reason why. And it's based in this idea of chivalry, I think, because if you look at the chivalrous code of conduct of a knight, it was to protect the woman's innocence. And that role was assigned to her, and the man was in charge of protecting that to a degree, right? Unless she's Muslim, or unless she's not a queen, or unless she's, if she's a peasant, okay, well, her dignity then doesn't really matter, and her innocence doesn't really matter, and her virginity doesn't really matter. So to a very small, very select group of women, they're concerned with maintaining these ideals, but otherwise, not really. And so it's the formation of these gender roles that are almost playing out in our society today. Now, I know that these things have been entrenched over centuries and centuries and centuries, but I honestly believe that we're starting to get to a place where we can start undoing some of these things. There's never been a better time to be alive than right now in the course of entire human history, especially if you're a woman, but if you're a man too. I mean, just medical advances for one, but if you're interested in really pursuing gender equality, now is the best chance we have of doing that throughout all of human history, and that's really exciting. Let's fast forward a few hundred years and just kind of skip over a bunch of boring blah. When men were interested in marrying a woman, for hundreds of years, they would hold court. Now, the whole idea of, this is where courting comes from. The whole idea of going to or holding court comes from, you heard of King Arthur's court. Any landowner would be the judge for his little community, and he would hold court. People would come to him and they would admonish him, or that's not the right word. Oh my goodness. People would come to him and they would ask for stuff, okay? And they would try to convince him to do stuff for him. How's that? And he would then make his determination. And so this is the same approach that they took towards a man trying to convince the landowner, essentially, to let him marry his daughter. And so the man would call upon the woman he was interested in. If they're rich, of course. I mean, if they're peasants, obviously, and this is the funny thing, right? Our history doesn't really like touch too much on the peasant lives because they don't really matter. At least that's how we viewed it throughout all of that entire time, and like still kind of right now. That's kind of messed up and sad. But when we're talking about the origin of the word courtship and courting to marry, it comes from this idea of, even like in Downton Abbey, right? We're fast forwarding all the way up to like the 1900s. The woman is there waiting at home. The man comes, and if he's invited into the house, he will come and talk with the woman and the woman's parents in her house. And during this time, it has a lot to do with how rich he is, his pedigree. How's that word choice, right? Pretty good. I almost didn't think of it, and then boom, it came into my head. Yes. Has to do with his pedigree, his family, lineage, all this stuff, right? Whether he was a qualified candidate or not. And what's really interesting is it did start to morph as the woman started to have a little bit more say, which took like hundreds of years. But, it started getting to the point where it wasn't just purely arranged. The woman had a little bit of input. And not even a lot still. Sometimes it was entirely arranged, and majority of the time it sounds like it was, based off of what I've read, since, I wasn't there. But there was a point where she started to develop a little bit more say. And this was an interesting cultural shift because it appeared as though the power differential had swung the opposite way, where the man was now in a more subservient, more humble role, coming to the house to see if the woman would allow him to enter. And the woman, you've seen those paintings of them sitting in these aristocratic positions where they are like, the woman has this haughty demeanor, and she's there sort of looking down on the man saying like, why should I marry you? Convince me. And in a way, we're sort of thinking like, whoa, this is pretty badass. Like, this lady is like, good for her. That's awesome. The problem is there were repercussions for that. And I believe it was another attempt that we make to try to compensate for these imbalances of power or things culturally that aren't going the way that intuitively, deep down, we know they should. And it's really interesting. Richard Rohr says that whenever he goes to visit a Catholic monastery in an area that's particularly patriarchal, what he finds is that the amount that these communities try to honor Mary, is the mother of Jesus, is proportional to how patriarchal they are. And so the more dominated these communities are by men, the more there's this sort of collective unconscious way of trying to elevate Mary, which Mary is sort of the archetypal feminine representation. And so we do have this way of understanding that things are imbalanced, and we have this way of trying to accommodate for that. But the problem is we always mess it up. We never get it right, because if the root of the problem is a problem, oh guys, okay, but hey, we're doing it. We're talking, right? We're doing it right now. That's rad. Okay, if the root of the problem, if the root of the thing is a problem, then any way that we try to compensate or we try to make up for it is going to be insufficient. And we can sort of see that, in my opinion, this is what developed with the idea of courting someone, which is they're trying to give the woman a little bit of power in this situation. They're trying to even out the power differential. But what's really interesting is that in the books I've read in classic literature and even history books, the impression that I've got is that it's pretty common that the man is actually affronted by this whole courting process. And he'll even explicitly sometimes say in these fictional stories, which I know it's fiction, but we have to assume that these fictional stories are based on real life events and at least things that are pervasive throughout the culture, which the culture can resonate with, right? It's not as if they're just like totally way off base. But so these fictional stories can and should give us an indication of generally what things were like back then. But that in these stories, the man would almost say, wait till we get married. Like, I'm going to get you back for this. And throughout that process of sort of him having to assume a more humble position, which was not indicative of the social situation in any other aspect of the man's life, he's sort of saying, like, wait till we get married and I assume the position of power, then you'll see. Then I'm going to get you back for this me having to suffer, quote unquote, humiliation, right? I have to come here and talk to you and try to convince you to marry me. What an awful humiliation. So stupid. But that seems to be a relatively common theme throughout the courting process, which is the man feeling like he is having to base himself and humiliate himself and suffer some intolerable treatment just to get a wife. And that often results in him trying to reciprocate in a negative way to the woman that he ends up marrying, which is a great start to any marriage, by the way. I'm just kidding. Let's fast forward from there to the 1920s, which is when dating started to make its approach onto the cultural scene. They say in like 1900, 1910, 3 out of 4 people lived outside of urban areas. But with the Industrial Revolution, the increase in jobs, the decrease in living cost in urban areas, the invention of the automobile, and things like electricity, all of these things started making living in cities more appealing, especially for people who were lower class. They could actually make a decent living. And women started developing a lot more opportunities in these situations as well, because they could actually get a good quote unquote a good job, right, working in a factory for like 12 hours a day, and consequently getting paid about half as much as a man, because they were they were able to be exploited as a low cost working force because they had relatively little rights, which is so messed up. But as people begin to migrate into urban areas, and as the automobile began to become a lot more common because of Henry Ford, people started saying, let's meet at a neutral site. Let's stop going to people's parents' house, and let's abandon the idea of courting, and let's go on a date where we agree on a date on the calendar. You and I will meet up and we'll spend time together at a neutral location. Now, isn't this kind of crazy that the woman giving up this relative position of power where she is the one with men coming to her, trying to convince her why they're good candidates for marriage, her going to a quote-unquote neutral, her giving up her home field advantage, that's a step backwards, right? But obviously, no, it's not. It's a huge step forwards, because now, and obviously in tons of ways, she's out of her parents' watchful eye. Like, she can actually have a huge role in determining whether she likes the actual time spent with this person, because she actually gets to spend time with them in a place other than like the library or the tea room or whatever, and they get to like go have fun together. So her giving up this relative position of power opens up the door to all of this additional freedom and actual equality, more equality in this situation. The problem is, like, from what I've read, these women were making half as much as a man. I've read actually around this time that women would go out on dates just to be able to like get a free meal. And so the idea that the man would pay for the food or the date was sort of predicated based off of necessity. But not only necessity, but there's still a little bit of that history from the age of courting, right? Which is, hey, let me convince you to go out with me. Like, I will give you an incentive. And, some of these things are hard to let go of. And they're like ingrained over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of the man coming to the woman in a position of trying to win her over or to convince her that I'm the right one for you. Give me a chance. Let me convince you. And so the man paying for the date was partly out of necessity because the women were the recipients of incredible inequity in terms of the pay gap, but also because there's still a little bit of that left over. Still a little bit of that sort of unhealthy, I can't think of the word. All in all, the start of dating was a total win for women, in my opinion. And the reason why is because in like 1910, they say that if you were a woman and you were in a saloon, you were by definition a prostitute. Like, no women went there or no women could go there. Regardless of the reason, that's just not what was happening. But within a span of like 10 to 20 years, all of a sudden, women are like out on the town enjoying themselves. And that's in the 20s when you hear of like the term flapper, the ladies wearing these sparkling short dresses, women who are drinking in public, women who are kind of living like a normal life. It was this huge cultural shift. And a lot of it had to do with dating and the invention of dating. But it's really interesting to see how this progress has led into different stages of our cultural experience. Because what happened is as these low income people, that's not a good way to say it, as these people coming from very humble beginnings in relative poverty moved into cities, they all of a sudden were presented new opportunities. And this came about because of a lot of different factors, but go a couple decades later to like the 30s, 40s, and now you're like into the 50s. You've seen the show The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, how she gets a job at a department store. This was like a really, really interesting transition for women in terms of their ability to jump classes. You have to, like, if you think back to the days of chivalry, there were laws instituted by the church, which we have to realize like that the church back then didn't play the role of church but of government. And so the whole thing was all messed up. But they didn't particularly want people jumping classes. Like there was no room for that in that cultural, I can't think of the word, but there was no room for it, okay? So they made a law that women had to dress according to their rank in society. If you were like a butcher's wife, you couldn't wear a fur coat in public because that's against the law. You can't try to mislead so stupid a man or whatever, to think that you're part of a certain class when you're really not. And so this was like a very rigid, not only, well, it is gender, yeah, because the law, it's a gender role, because the man can wear whatever clothes he wants. And so there's this gender assignment of, if you're a woman specifically, you have to dress in this certain way according to your class. But then you start getting into like the early to like middle early 1900s, and then what was happening is that all these lower income people, or like I said previously, whatever I used to describe that, those people like coming from like more humble beginnings, or like they had a low standing in society, they moved into cities, they're presented with opportunities, and then what would happen is these women would get jobs in department stores with the express purpose of finding a husband who was rich enough to shop at these department stores. And so that's what these women are doing, like in the show The Marvelous Miss Maisel, is they're like, they're putting on the perfume and they're trying to sell these items to men who are rich enough to shop there. The women themselves aren't rich enough to purchase their own clothes. And we see that all the time today. Like, brands that are really expensive are paying their employees minimum wage, but sort of requiring them to wear their own items. It's like you can't, like people at Anthropology or something, you can't afford to shop at your own store. They have to give them like a 60% off discount to be able to purchase that stuff on minimum wage. But these women would go into these department stores for this express purpose. And what's funny is that this was like a common thing. The men would go shop there to look for a wife. And this is like one of the first times where women actually had a chance at jumping classes. And this is, I know, like, I'm not cool with any of this, but I'm just trying to describe sort of what I've learned and what I understand has happened. But yeah, this whole thing is just crazy. But this was a big step for women, relatively speaking. I feel bad saying that because it's like still is messed up. But this is where the cultural significance and the cultural, I can't really think of the word, but the importance of makeup really came onto the scene in this area during this time, because these women were at these department stores selling these products, and through the use of makeup and perfume and these other things, they could improve their appearance as they were selling themselves, basically, I hate saying it like that too, but selling themselves to these men who were rich. And this is when the term personality also came onto the scene. Before that, personality was only used to describe disorders, like personality disorder. No one had ever used the term personality to say like, well, she has a good personality. But this is just really interesting. And when we talk about how words have deep meaning and we look at the term personality, it's so fascinating that personality comes from the Latin word persona. And persona, when you break it down, the first part is per, right, which means through. And sonus is like sound. And so persona is something that a Greek or I'm not an expert, but from what I understand, I don't really know what time period actually, but it's a mask worn in a play that the person would speak through. All right, so sound would be coming through this mask that the person is wearing on their face, and that was called a persona. And the sort of the classic what's it called? The classic whatever the little thing is with in a play, where there's like the happy mask and the sad mask, and that's like represents art or something. Those masks are personas. And as makeup made its way into our culture, becoming like a cultural staple, we coincidentally started using the term personality as well. And they're very closely related. Like you're making your face look a certain way, like you're putting a mask on almost. And it is now this thing that you're speaking through. And anyways, the whole thing got tied up into like someone having a personality. And this is where the term like it girl came from. And if you know about like, you watch movies or something with like Audrey Hepburn or whatever, and some of those other people, like even Marilyn Monroe, there's like a movie called It Girl, and like the it was personality. And at that time they said like, if you have it, like you can get any guy you want and stuff. And there was like this whole thing about it. But this period still marks a big shift, a big cultural shift for women in terms of our journey towards equality, at least our journey towards where we are today. And hopefully we're still on the journey towards actual equality. We've been moving in that direction, and it's taken a really long time. Hopefully we will be able to continue making steps towards real equality. My question is now for all of us today, I want us to seriously consider, especially if you're a woman, and I'm not trying to tell you what's best. I've only been trying to say a bunch of facts and allow us to all make a determination on what we want to do with those facts. But it does seem to me that at every stage, when we are willing to let go of this feigned idea of power that we have, this position that we hold on to as something that is good for us. But that's the result of this messed up system that we're in. Like, I'm in this messed up system, but this messed up system has created this one or two areas where I have relative power. Like, yes, there's a lot of gender inequality, but when I go on a date, everybody does kind of agree that somebody should buy my meal. That idea of holding on to that is very alluring because it's like a tangible thing that matters to me, that is representative of the whole thing. Just like when the woman is in the courting process and the man is waiting outside, like the idea of, I could send this guy home if I wanted to. I have that power, even though she kind of really didn't, but you see what I mean? You know, letting go of that and entering into the arena of dating, meeting on like a neutral turf, spending time out with a guy, like that's a huge step forward. And there's multiple iterations. I think that's a word. I'm not even sure if that's a word. There's like a lot of different representations of that in multiple different ways throughout this story, throughout this history that I've been trying to like outline. And I don't want to spend too much more time diving into the details, but the ultimate question that I want to leave us with today, all right, we're almost there. Hey, we've almost done it. This is cool, man. So the question I want to leave us with today is letting go of this idea of chivalry, is that a necessary step on the journey towards real equality? If you really enjoy gender roles, and that's something that you find stability in and security in, I have no problem with that. And I think that everybody gets to make a determination on that, and that's fine. And that's great for you. If that's the case, then chivalry is probably something that you want to hold on to. And I totally respect that. And so I don't want to put my viewpoints on you. But if you recognize that rigid gender roles are kind of tied into the whole idea of inequality and are a roadblock from ultimately arriving at true equality, then we might realize that chivalry is something that we want to let go of. And that can be scary because the question is, well, then what? Will I be respected? And how will I be treated? And what do I deserve? And how can I know that my honor and my character is being sought after? And these are all questions that the idea of chivalry is designed to stabilize, right? If I pay for somebody's meal, I am acting upon principles that are designed to address these questions. And so in a way, it's very easy to seem like a good gentlemanly guy if I open the door, right? Because this action sort of represents a more implicit subtext. There's an implicit subtext to the action. But just like we talked about the guy coming to court the woman and feigning humility in that process, that doesn't illuminate his true motives or his true thoughts or the way he really views you. It's just an action. Sometimes there's meaning behind it, but sometimes somebody might be resentful about it. And there's all kinds of I shouldn't say that. There's all kinds of people with like very interesting viewpoints that I disagree with on the internet about, saying, it's not fair that guys have to do this. Like, what's chivalry look like for a woman and stuff? It's like, okay, yeah, okay, no, we're not. I can't talk to you. But that's okay. All right, that's okay. My question for you, for men and women, is, do we want to let chivalry die? And there is some apprehension that can be associated with that because we are giving up something that can be nice. And it can make us feel really good at times. But there's a process that is very deeply, deeply tied into our human experience. And there's representations of it throughout every single area of our lives. And that's the idea of death and rebirth. We sometimes have to let things die and go through a process of death and separation and pain and loss before the new, beautiful, better version 2.0, the improved way of life, a deeper understanding, a more clear way of viewing things can be realized. We can find this in so many different areas of life. In nature, this process in nature is so crucial to the very structure and essence of nature, that things have to die. They go back into the ground and they're reborn. And this is how nature continues to exist and evolve and to become more beautiful. And it's in religion, it's in our own lives and relationships. And I don't think we need to spend too much more time trying to convince that the idea of death and rebirth is real and it's important and it's necessary when we're trying to grow. And so I want to leave you with that. Do we need to let chivalry die in order for something deeper, something better, something that's more deeply grounded in equality? Do we need to let it die before that new thing can be realized? That's the question. And I'm going to leave you with that. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts and your feedback. If you made it this far, dude, you're awesome. Straight up, you're awesome. And I love you. I really do. So thank you. And I appreciate it. We will catch you next time. Bye.